Welcome to this 30-minute soft skills presentation entitled Managing Risk in Uncertain Times. My name is Heather Santos, and I'm on the enablement team here at Sophos. Running the presentation today, we have John Shire, research scientist. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the Sophos Hub and the Partner Portal. All attendees will be on mute for the duration of the presentation. However, please feel free to post questions via the Q&A panel, and questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. We'll also post an FAQ along with the recording after the event. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, John.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us in the session on managing risk. After all, that's the business that we're in as security practitioners, as security product manufacturers. We give you the products to mitigate that risk, and it's up to you to implement them in order to manage the risk. And so I'll be talking a little bit about today around, topics around the threat landscape, what we're seeing, what things have changed, and I'll be addressing specifically some of the pandemic-related things that have changed in the threat landscape. And then I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about how we manage risk when it comes to working from home, and more specifically now that we're approaching the return to work and going back into the office. So a little bit more about me. I work in the office of the CTO, and my job is to sit sort of at the center of a lot of our research teams. So our Sophos Labs incident response team, data science team, our threat mitigation team, exploit mitigation team, and sort of take all of the outputs that they produce and their research, and then marry that with a lot of what we're seeing in the broader security industry in order to help advise people on, first, what's happening, and then secondly, what can we do about it in terms of security practitioners. And so that entails a lot of traveling, which means I get to go to a lot of security conferences, Sophos events, and I do end up speaking at a lot of these security conferences. So this is what it would have looked like in 2019. As with many of you, I'm stuck at home, so now this is what it looks like now when I give presentations. And I also wanted to give you guys a little bit of a taste of what Canadian lockdown is like. As we're all sheltering in place, different countries have different ways of portraying how we should socially distance. So I found this a little bit amusing, which is the province of Yukon. The government there released a couple of diagrams about how to stay safe and socially distance. So either you stay one caribou apart, or you stay two huskies apart. So while we're all staying safe and sheltering in place, let's talk a little bit now about how we can stay more secure during the pandemic. And the first thing I really want to talk about is just COVID-19 itself, how it's manifested itself in the threat landscape, and if there's anything to worry about. So in mid-April, we started looking at how many domains had been created that were COVID-19 coronavirus themed. So anything that had those words or derivations of those words in the domains. And we found about a little over 1,700 of them. So people, mostly scammers, were actually getting quite busy trying to craft these domains, most likely to include in spam campaigns like the ones we're seeing in front of us. And the actual campaign started in Italy, interestingly enough. As the pandemic was really exercising its toll in Italy, we started seeing a lot more spam directed at Italian citizens. As a matter of fact, one of the big botnets out there, TrickBot, started spamming citizens of Italy on 4 March. And the rest of the spread of these scams actually followed quite closely with the real world spread of the disease. And what we found is this is really just the existing scammers changing their tactics a little bit and taking advantage of a whole new situation. Now, we had the ones that were already doing the puppy scams. Basically, you could order a puppy from a shelter or from a breeder. You pay them the money, they ship you the animal or drive it to you. These things have been going around for some time. I found some evidence of this back in 2017, but now they've shifted to having more of a COVID theme to them. People are staying in their homes. Maybe they want a little extra company, something to do, something to walk, and so they've shifted to COVID-19 hooks for these scams. And below that, we see an example of a sextortion scam. Those are the types of scams where you get an email from somebody claiming they've got compromising photos or videos of you, and they try to prove it by also showing you an old password from a data breach and saying if you don't pay to the address, in this case the Bitcoin wallet in the screenshot, then they're going to send all of this compromising material to people in your address book, which no doubt includes friends, family, and possibly coworkers. The Canadian pharmacies, the ones that usually sell your Cialis and your Viagra, they've also retooled a little bit and are offering hydroxychloroquine. And the World Health Organization is also being targeted through their relief efforts. And so this particular scam here is all about trying to give money to the WHO Relief Fund, but obviously it's not going to the World Health Organization, it's going to the criminals. And these guys did their homework. They actually crafted the email quite well. And they even, we can't see it, it's cut off at the bottom, but they even included the signature of the actual director involved with this particular effort on behalf of the World Health Organization. So they did a little open source intelligence and made it look as real as possible. And then finally below that, we're seeing a screenshot from the Maze ransomware gang, which are basically saying, hey, we're, even though we're criminals, we're still in the same economic situation as you. And so, we're prepared to negotiate if times are difficult for you, but our capabilities, what we can do. And this is one of the gangs that likes to publish people's data that they steal just prior to encrypting it. So kind of business as usual when it comes to these guys. And just to prove that, here's another example that we found in our spam traps. It's a COVID-19 themed spam that the HTML version is COVID-19, but if you do a right-click view source, you see that it's just your typical old waybill invoice type of scam that they forgot to change in the source of the email. And this one had an attachment that said COVID who recommended. It was obviously a piece of malware that was a credential stealer and info stealer in this case. So consistent MO. And as far as the prevalence of this kind of stuff, the good news is it's only about 3 to 4% of the overall spam we see on a daily basis. So daily we see around 320, 300 to 340 billion spams a day. That amounts to about 10 billion of these, just under 10 billion being these spams. So thankfully nobody's really falling for these. We've been tracking those Bitcoin wallets, and we haven't seen any money going into them. And we're also pretty good at detecting this stuff. Most competent email and web products that are filtering for this kind of stuff will actually never let this end up in a customer's inbox. So that's the good news. Let's move on and talk about the threat landscape itself. As far as the threat landscape goes, it's kind of the same as it ever was. It's pretty much stabilized in a sense that a lot of the actors that are involved in the threat landscape today are well-known people. A lot of the tricks, the tactics that they use are also well-known tricks and tactics. As a matter of fact, the Verizon data breach investigation report, which was just released yesterday, the top two sort of threat actions were phishing and use of stolen credentials. So not really, I guess, any surprise there. That's the thing that's been impacting companies and individuals for quite some time, but it's really risen to the ranks to being number 1 and 2 at this point. And as far as the nation state groups, the APTs, they're still going to get you. There's not a lot you can do to completely keep them out of your networks. They are well resourced and patient. But the cyber criminals, the ransomware gangs, the organized criminals, even the sort of the petty garden variety cyber criminals, the script kiddies, they're still fairly opportunistic. They do have some tactics changes that they've been trying for the last sort of 18 months. We call them automated active attacks, where they use a blend of automation with human interaction. But a lot of it does still depend on an opportunistic bent, so that they're finding their targets based on an automated scan, and then from there they're deciding on how to act. So it's really not who you are, as in the case of the nation state, but what you are. So and that what is very often vulnerable. And most threats do start with an email. So this is a snapshot of an infographic for the Emotet Trojan. And what I want to highlight here is just the groups that Emotet, the customers of Emotet, the groups that they distribute. They started as a credential stealer, and now they are pretty much a distribution platform for all these banking Trojans. These are the customers of Emotet. And the names that we see here aren't new. Azerol, Ursnif, Qbot, TrickBot, Drydex, these are all older threats. As a matter of fact, Emitet's been around since 2014, TrickBot since 2016, Drydex as early as potentially 2011. And so these are known entities. TrickBot also has an association with the Ryuk ransomware. So this also highlights how the threat landscape has really turned into sort of economic relationships, right? So Emitet will sell their services to TrickBot, which will then deploy ransomware after they're done doing financial fraud on your bank account. So banking Trojans are there to simply steal your banking credentials or enable or facilitate some kind of financial fraud. And once they've done that and they can't extract any more money from you, or they just didn't work, then they'll just simply send down ransomware to your machine. And we'll talk a little bit about ransomware in a minute, but this whole ecosystem is really emblematic of what we're seeing in the threat landscape right now. A lot of groups working together with specialties in what they do best, and then selling those services on to others as well. But some more good news, through all of the effort that we as practitioners and producers of security software have done, things like our Intercept X, and specifically with our machine learning additions to the anti-malware platform, we're forcing complexity on a lot of these guys. If you look on the left-hand side, the infection process here for a fairly obscure info stealer out of Brazil called Astaroth, these are all the hoops they have to jump through in order to infect a machine. There's an email, there's a couple JavaScripts, there's a couple DLLs, and before any of that executes, right, they still have to do an anti-analysis check as well to make sure they're not running on a researcher's machine or inside one of our automated analysis machines. And this kind of forced complexity has been because of the work we've all done together collectively at protecting our endpoints. And without this, and this is like I said, a fairly minor player in the threat landscape, but even they're having to do this kind of work in order to infect the machine. And what that's doing is it's raising the bar in terms of the skill level, the resources, the cost to an attack for the cyber criminals. So, what we're doing is we always, in a lot of these talks, we kind of look at the bad side of things, but I want to celebrate some of our wins here, which is by putting this technology in place in their way, it's actually forcing them to get better at what they do. So let's talk a little bit about ransomware, because that's sort of the one topic that gets carved off a lot here. And again, going back to the data breach investigation report, according to the incidents that they analyzed, ransomware accounted for about 27%, so a fairly big chunk, if you will, of the nearly a third of the threat landscape is ransomware alone. But we've seen some interesting changes here as well. So no longer are they purely opportunistic. There is a little bit of that, and by that I mean hire a spammer to send out 100,000 emails and hopefully you get a bunch of endpoints infected with your ransomware. That's largely gone. Now we're seeing more of a targeted scenario here with a lot of these gangs, and we've also forced them to innovate again because of things like Sophos CryptoGuard that is quite adept at stopping ransomware. We've seen these guys try to do all sorts of different tricks, like importing signed vulnerable drivers. So a legitimate driver that's signed by Microsoft, but that has a vulnerability in it, so that they can then piggyback off that vulnerability and import their additional malicious drivers to infect the machine. That's the Robin Hood gang that was doing that. And the Snatch gang was, when they got onto a machine, they would install themselves as a service and then force the machine to reboot into safe mode, knowing that most security products don't run in safe mode, so that they could then infect the machine. So forcing innovation and complexity in that way on the ransomware side of things as well. So I said, they went from a more opportunistic to a targeted form of attack. That really is where we see this automated active attack scenario, where one of these gangs will use maybe Shodan or some other type of Census or some other type of scanner to scan the internet for maybe remote desktop machines. And if they find a bunch of them, they'll then throw a tool like NLBrute, or even just grab some compromised passwords and see if they can log into these machines. And when they do, once they're inside the network, they proceed to elevating privileges. They proceed to laterally moving across the network. But the way they're doing that is with, again, known tools and some automation. But there's also a human factor involved here. And that human factor is what makes it a little bit more difficult to defend against some of these more modern attacks. But they've also evolved the way that they actually impact your systems. So in the very beginning of ransomware, it was very much just encrypt the data and then ask for a ransom. Well, now we're seeing a change there, because especially when it was relatively easy, and I'm using that word carefully, but relatively easy in some cases to just re-image a desktop or a laptop and get back to business as usual, these guys weren't getting a lot of money. And so what they've realized is, well, the shift from endpoint to server is where the real money is made, because servers are, of course, of more value to the cyber criminals. And they've also turned to stealing the data. So not only are they going to encrypt it, but before they encrypt it, they steal it in order to pressure you and make you more likely to pay the ransom and to retrieve the key. They've done this through various means, and one particular gang was actually using a file synchronization tool on a file server in order to get the latest and greatest copies of all the documents that were being saved onto that file server before they actually activated the ransomware. And then, in the old days, they would delete the backups that, they'd delete the shadow copies and any other backups they could get their hands on. And now they've resorted to stealing backups. So they'll actually, because they have your credentials in many cases, because they've done, their escalated privileges, they're probably domain admin on your network. We've seen one gang that was restoring Veeam, so virtual machine backups, into a cloud into machines that the attackers were controlling. So at that point, they had everything they needed, and they were able to launch their encryption piece after that. And then finally, in order to pressure people to pay up, they've also started threatening to release the data. And we've seen a few gangs started doing this. Like I said before, the Maze ransomware gang is definitely one of the ones that is more prominent in doing this, and they've actually released information on people in the past. And not only are they threatening to release the information, but they're also threatening the employees of a lot of the companies. So they're saying, we've installed software on these machines, we're going to encrypt, and we've encrypted all the servers, but we've also stolen the data of the company, which includes your personal data, right? So if there's any HR data in there, they've got all of your personal information, and they're threatening the employees that if they don't put pressure on their employers, that they will release that data, including all of the PII that's associated with that. And then finally, I saw this just the other day. These guys are not too. They're not afraid of nickel and diming you to death. In this case here, there was a ransomware group that they got paid for the decryption key, $350,000, but they didn't pay for deleting the stolen files, right? So they're coming back to the well saying, well, you paid for this one part of the quote unquote service. We want payment for the other. So there's never enough for these guys when it comes to getting money. Now, we've seen through our 2020 ransomware report that about 30% of the victims do pay the ransom. But the thing with ransomware is whether you pay the ransom or not, you still have to put money in to do the recovery. And so 90% of the effort of recovering from a ransomware attack has nothing really to do with the ransomware attack itself. It's basically fixing your infrastructure. And so paying the ransom actually doubles the cost of recovery for a lot of these cases. So you still have to do the remediation, whether you pay or not. And when most people notice an encryption or a ransomware attack is on the day that all their files get encrypted. But the reality is most of these gangs have been in there for days, weeks, if not months in some cases. And so fixing that infrastructure is of paramount importance. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about working from home and really back to the office, which is the situation that we find ourselves in. And events like the WannaCry attack that happened 3 years ago, and the pandemic are good opportunities to determine the security readiness of your organization. And for a lot of people, the very simple task of applying patches while people were working remotely was difficult because, one, you didn't know if they got there because your monitoring was poor, or you were set up in such a way that you could only apply the patches if the computers were on the LAN. And so, WannaCry was one of those attacks that relied on not a 0-day, but an already patched vulnerability. And even when everybody was working in the office, we still hadn't patched it, and therefore it did the damage that it did. And then if we look at a typical APT-style attack, typical nation-state attack, there's a lot of telltale factors here that go into an APT attack. There's the reconnaissance phase, where they might do a malicious pen test against your organization, or even just send in some phishing emails. And once they're inside, they'll explore the environment. They'll live off the land, if you will, by using things like PowerShell and PSExec, which is consistently one of our top potentially unwanted applications. Mimikatz, which was just updated the other day to support Windows 10 1904, I believe it was. I've even seen some groups that are using Active Directory policies, GPOs, to push out instructions on how to grab a DLL to then infect and encrypt files across the network. And so the next step is usually with a lot of these APT groups is exfiltration, right? What's the target? And very often it's intellectual property. They'll exfiltrate that information. Then finally, there's the disruption phase. Specifically, the Iranians are very much into the disruption. They release wipers on the network in order to wipe all the data after they've done their exfiltration. And if you look at the protection that's needed to protect against a sophisticated attacker like that, patching, phishing awareness, credential hardening by using things like multi-factor authentication, simple use of application control to block things like Mimikatz and PSExec, and then even to the advanced anti-malware, anti-exploit tools like InterceptX, and then finally the threat hunting piece. That if you've got, if you're mature enough in your security, you can start looking at the threat hunting piece. All of those protections look a lot like what you need to protect against the financially motivated attackers as well. And the DBIR, the one thing that they overwhelmingly showed was that most of these attacks are financially motivated. So the ransomware criminals, the Emitetts, the TrickBots, the Drydexes of the world, these kinds of protections are going to smash these guys on the head, and they're going to take care of the script kiddies, no problem. And so now that we're in this scenario here that we've never seen before, this is a time when we start looking at, do we have all these things in place? And coming back into work specifically, there's a little bit of advice that I want to give you guys, which is you might want to consider quarantining these devices as they're coming back in, because maybe due to lack of monitoring and the ability to push patches, coupled with the fact that this might have been the machine that was being used to also do distance learning by the kids. And, when you're not looking, they install a game and a crack to play the game, to play the game without having to pay for it. All this kind of software that the activities have been going on that you haven't been able to monitor, put them on a quarantine network. You might want to consider a reimage if that's necessary, but do a deep scan. So grab your copy of InterceptX and launch it at this machine and make sure that nothing is hiding on that machine. The other side of quarantine is you may have customers that they had to use their personal devices in order to keep productive, and so there's going to be some PII, there's going to be some intellectual property potentially on these personal devices. Bring them in, put them into quarantine, and then figure out how you can safely move the data back to the corporate network as well. As a matter of fact, there was a story of I heard recently of, I believe it was an insurance company, that for regulatory reasons they can't have any data whatsoever on personal machines, and so everybody gets given a desktop. It stays in the office. Well, when the lockdown hit, they didn't have enough time to provision everybody with a device, a corporate device, and so everybody went home. And what they had to subsequently do is rent out some trucks, put all the desktops in the trucks, drive them around to people's homes, and then through online coaching, get IT to coach everybody on how to install the VPN client and how to connect back into the office. And so they didn't have a plan or contingency for something like this, and so they had to go through all of that effort. The next is, I think you want to consider amnesty for some of your employees that maybe got creative when it came time to staying productive and doing their work. Maybe because they weren't provided with a cloud account to save their documents to, maybe they went and got their own. They Dropbox or Box or whatever service that they used in order to stay productive and share files with their coworkers, or new communications platforms like WhatsApp as opposed to the Teams, for example. Instead of berating the employees, say, hey, what did you have to do? What kind of improvisations did you need to do in order to get your work done, and then consider that as part of maybe the changes you're going to make going forward in allowing people to work from home, and also as part of your disaster recovery program, because you might discover some shadow IT that was done out of necessity. And then you can work on your instrumentation. If you had problems with updates, now's the time to figure that out. And stop using USBs, right? These are notoriously difficult to secure, to protect. They get lost easily, and we've seen countless examples of how a simple USB drive with confidential data gets left on a train, and it causes all sorts of headaches and lost productivity for the company involved. So now that we've got all these very robust and capable cloud services, and whichever one you choose to use, if you use Office 365, start using OneDrive. If you're, if you've got another one that you prefer, like Box.com, start using that. But make it the standard and make it easy for people to use. That's really the key here. And then finally, take that leap into multi-factor authentication and password managers. If you haven't done so already, this will really help, because what we're seeing right now is also a very dramatic spike in Office 365 phishing, because everybody's working remotely and accessing these services remotely. And so if you do it now, it's probably going to hurt. It's going to be a pain to do, but you'll be really glad you did next time something like this happens or forces your hand to work from home. And after you've done all of that, you update your business continuity plan. As a matter of fact, this one financial services company that I was speaking to in Asia, their business continuity plan was working from home. So they had most of this stuff in place, and they were able to very seamlessly transition from working in the office to working from home. As a matter of fact, Twitter and one other, I can't remember which one, maybe Slack, I think, have just basically said, if you want to work from home forever now, that's up to you, and you can exercise that right. So I think we're going to see a change, a transition in the ways that businesses deal with this kind of stuff. So updating your business continuity plan is very much appropriate here, because it doesn't have to be a pandemic. It could be a fire, a flood, a tornado, whatever. Something could prevent you from going into the office, and you're going to need to have a plan for how to keep working. So the other side of that is, while we're all contemplating returning to the office, we may be faced with a situation in the next few months where we have to go back into lockdown. And so these tips here, and this is a good time to take a picture or a screenshot, are just some tips that help you frame what you will need to do. If you haven't done these things now, do it while you're going back to work. Do it as you're preparing to go back into the office, with the presence of mind to think that this may happen again. And again, it doesn't have to be a pandemic. It could very well be something other than a pandemic that forces you out of the office. But you want to make it easy for users to get started. Like the desktop example that I gave earlier, right? These employees were at a standstill because they could not work due to the regulatory compliance that their company had to follow. And then creating secure connections back into the office, right? If you don't have a VPN for some of your employees, specifically your IT people, to be able to administer the machines, the answer is not putting a machine, exposing RDP to the internet. The answer is using a VPN with two-factor authentication to get onto the inside to then manage those machines. As a matter of fact, as far as RDP goes, we saw a fairly, a decent growth. Pre-pandemic levels were a little over 3 million exposed RDP hosts on the internet, according to Shodan. And during this period, I looked yesterday, it's a little over 4 million. So about 1 million RDP machines were added to the internet between pre-COVID days, and by pre-COVID I'm talking about like the last fall, so October, November, December timeframe, and to now. So people are trying to find ways to work around this kind of stuff. Make it easy. Don't let them make bad mistakes. So that said, I'm going to look and see if we have any questions. And it doesn't appear that we have any. So we've got 1 minute left. If somebody wants to get a last-minute question in, go for it. That said, thank you for attending. I hope you found this useful. And we're working this together as Sophos and our partners are trying to keep everybody secure and safe. we've got an important job to do, especially now that we might be stuck in a world where most people are working from home and are requiring additional security. So it doesn't look like there are any questions. So I'll thank you for your attendance and give it back to Heather.
Great, thank you, John. Just a reminder that the information from today's session will be posted on the Sophos Hub and the Partner Portal. You'll receive an email that includes a link to the recording, along with the PowerPoint presentation and FAQs. Thanks for joining, everyone, and we'll see you next time.